My chat. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to have you all here, and welcome to the launch of Central London Forward's infrastructure priorities. I'm Elizabeth Campbell, and as well as my role as leader of the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, I'm chair of Central London Forward. And before we begin, I want to take you through just a couple of brief housekeeping points. Today's event is being recorded so people can watch it back later. And we're really keen for this event to be interactive. So please do ask your questions on the Q&A box below. And we'll be sending out a link to the report after today's event. And we hope to wrap up by about 3 o'clock. So again, thank you for coming to the launch of Central London's infrastructure priorities. It's been developed by Central London Forward, which is the sub-regional partnership of the 12 Central London local authorities, which aim to support inclusive growth in the capital. Infrastructure plays a vital role in underpinning Central London's economic success by keeping the city and its people moving, connected, and productive. Maintaining modern, sustainable infrastructure will be absolutely vital to ensure the capital remains both a preeminent world city, an engine of growth for the UK, and a great place to live for Londoners. Investing in infrastructure will be particularly important as we seek to respond to the climate emergency. As the Prime Minister has rightly argued in the run-up to COP26, the sheer scale and urgency of this challenge demands significant action now. This will mean investing in infrastructure both to reduce the emissions that contribute to climate change and to become more resilient to the changes climate change will bring. But we know there are challenges to delivering the infrastructure that we need. The government has said that as part of their levelling up agenda, they're seeking to pivot investment in infrastructure away from the capital. And we know the pandemic has put pressure on TfL's finances, which will make investing in transport infrastructure even more difficult. And that is why we've come together to develop Central London's infrastructure priorities. This report makes the case for investing in infrastructure in the capital. It highlights the shared infrastructure priorities of the 12 Central London boroughs, and it sets out how these projects can be delivered. And of course, this is not about investing in London instead of the rest of the UK. We believe there's a strong case for investment in infrastructure across the country. And with the spending review due next week, we're keen to work with government to deliver these projects, which we believe will benefit both the capital and the UK as a whole. I'd now like to introduce Georgina Brightwell, who's a policy officer at Central London Forward, who has led on this report. She'll present an overview of the report and the priorities. We'll then have a panel discussion with contributions from London First, London Councils, and TfL. So please do feel free to leave questions for the panel on the Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. And if you have any technical issues, then use the chat function. So I am now going to hand over to Georgina.
Thank you very much, Councillor Campbell, and may I echo her welcome everyone today to this launch event for Central London's infrastructure priorities. Ensuring we have modern, sustainable infrastructure is absolutely crucial for the future of London. Our economic success as a city relies in large part on infrastructure, from the transport system that keeps us moving to the digital infrastructure that keeps us connected. Infrastructure is vital to the city's productivity. Given London's role in the national economy, this matters for the whole of the UK too. London's economy is deeply interconnected to the regional economies across the UK, so that when London prospers, the rest of the UK does too. The capital also generates a significant surplus, which helps power investment in infrastructure and public services nationwide. Our ability to deliver the homes we need also relies on infrastructure. If we are to deliver the tens of thousands of homes that the city needs every year, we will need to continue our investment in infrastructure. And infrastructure is also crucial to responding to the climate emergency. If we are to reduce emissions across the capital and adapt to the changes global warming will inevitably bring, we will need to invest in our existing and the future infrastructure. But we face significant challenges in delivering that. As part of their levelling up agenda, the government has committed to investing in infrastructure, but London is not at the front of the queue here. The recent National Infrastructure Strategy talks of pivoting investment away from London. The pandemic has also caused significant challenges here. It's had a huge impact on TfL's finances, which undermines the ability to invest in modernising or extending transport infrastructure in the capital. This is why we have developed Central London's infrastructure priorities. Can I have the next slide, please? The first aim of this document is to make the case for investment in Central London's infrastructure, highlighting how this can benefit both the capital and the whole of the UK. The second aim is to highlight the projects that we collectively believe would have the most impact for the capital. We have worked with our member authorities to identify projects with the most benefit in terms of driving economic growth and job creation, unlocking new homes, and driving the transition to net zero. And I'd like to thank all of the councillors, officers, and partners who have helped us develop this document. The final aim of this project is to set out some ideas on how the infrastructure we need could be funded and delivered. By coming together as the 12 Central London local authorities and working with other major stakeholders in the capital, we hope that we can make a powerful case for investing in infrastructure in the capital, as well as across the regions and nations of the UK. Next slide, please. The CLF boroughs have collectively agreed on the 8 projects in this document. The first 5 are immediate priorities, the projects we need to deliver in the short term in order to drive a green recovery from the pandemic. First, the digital divide, whether that be through connectivity, skills, or access to equipment, was made clear at the start and throughout the pandemic. Despite London's built-up nature and reputation as a wealthy and high-tech city, there remain significant areas of poor connectivity. If London is to maintain its status as a global city, we need to deliver the rollout of full fibre across the capital to residential and commercial properties and address not spots such as the underground network. Secondly, it is imperative to continue investing in active travel in order to avoid a car-led recovery. Improving public realm and opportunities for walking in, around and between our town centres and high streets can help boost local economies, as well as tackling toxic air pollution and supporting the transition to net zero carbon. Further, a high quality cycle network is vital to helping cyclists feel safe and encouraging more people to make the shift away from private vehicles, particularly for short distance journeys. Third, we highlight that green infrastructure will be vital to reducing emissions in central London. All 12 central London local authorities have ambitious targets to achieve net zero carbon, as does the Mayor of London and the UK government. Delivering on these targets will require huge investment in projects such as retrofitting existing buildings and rolling out an electric vehicle charging network across the city. However, even if we do achieve our net zero ambitions, the world is likely to continue warming over the coming years. This will bring numerous risks, including increased extreme weather events such as flooding and heat waves, as well as higher sea levels. So this will require investment in flood prevention measures such as SUDs or sustainable drainage solutions and upgrading the Thames barrier. Owing to the scale and urgency of the problem, significant investment will be required from central government, local government and businesses to support the transition to net zero and adaptation to climate change. However, many of these changes will bring significant opportunities, including new green jobs and improvements to air quality and the public realm. Fourth, buses are the most used method of public transport in the capital, with more than 2 billion journeys per year pre-pandemic. Decarbonising London's buses is a key priority for the capital. Buses contribute about 10% of London's transport-related CO2 emissions, and they are a contributor to the capital's poor air quality. Decarbonising and electrifying London's buses and bus garages could help improve local air quality and help in the fight against climate change. Investing in London's buses would benefit both the capital and the rest of the UK. More than half of TfL's new zero emission fleet are procured within the UK, so this investment will help boost manufacturing across the country. And finally, in the short term, we should cast our eyes to perhaps London's most famous infrastructure attribute of the Underground. 2 lines in particular, the Northern and Piccadilly, as well as the Docklands Light Railway, could benefit from major renovation. This could not only increase frequency and capacity on the network, but also support regeneration and growth in key opportunity areas all across London. Many of the projects on these lines have been paused owing to the financial challenges caused by the pandemic, but should be prioritised as the lines will act as key interchanges between other government priority areas such as HS2 and Heathrow Airport, as well as supporting job creation across the whole of the UK. Next slide, please. Beyond these immediate priorities, we also set out 3 medium-term projects that can help London to continue to grow and thrive in the future. First, renovation of 2 of London's mainline terminals could have a transformative impact on both connectivity, capacity, and the local areas in which they are situated. Renovation of Euston is vital to maximising the benefits of the HS2 programme by linking up the new line, existing national railways, and the London transport network. Upgrading the public realm and public transport interchange at Waterloo will also create a more attractive and vibrant environment at the gateway to some of central London's most famous cultural and historical attractions. Second, the extension to the Bakerloo line through Southwark and Lewisham could have a transformative impact on South East London. It could connect 10 of London's opportunity areas, including Old Kent Road, New Cross, Lewisham and Catford, enable the construction of over 110,000 homes and create over 16,000 jobs. Safeguarding directions were handed down in March 2021 for the land required for the extension. However, owing to the financial impact of the pandemic, the project has been delayed and delivery remains dependent upon a viable financial package being put together. We need to maintain a commitment to this project and work together to enable its future delivery. Third, we have Crossrail 2. This new regional railway in South East England would link the national rail networks in Surrey and Hertfordshire via London. It's a high-cost project, but one which could have, again, another huge transformative impact for London and the South East, and significant benefits for the national economy. It's projected that Crossrail 2 could inject up to 150 billion into the UK economy and enable over 200,000 homes across the wider region. Like with the Bakerloo line extension, maintaining a commitment to developing this project remains a key priority for central London. Next slide, please. Thank you. At CLF, we acknowledge that the road to securing investment in and delivering infrastructure projects is never simple, and the current uncertain economic climate means this even more challenging. We have therefore set out a number of options as to how central London's infrastructure priorities can be met. Firstly, we believe that in the current context, there is a strong case for the government to invest directly in infrastructure in the capital and elsewhere in the UK. Investing in infrastructure can help to boost growth in the short term and build the productive capacity of the economy in the medium and long term. IMF analysis shows that an increase of 1% GDP invested in infrastructure boosts productivity by 1.5% after 4 years. In addition to those strong returns, the historically low cost of borrowing means the case for borrowing to invest in infrastructure is strong. Second, should central government not be able to invest in infrastructure in London, it should work with London's government to explore the potential to devolve fiscal powers to the capital. This could allow London to borrow in order to invest in the infrastructure the capital needs and to service the debt through revenue raised locally. Third, central government and London government need to work together to agree a fair and sustainable transport funding package for TfL, which maintains sufficient levels of public transport and enables TfL and London government to plan for the future. The pandemic has had a huge impact both on TfL and on transport providers across the UK. Ensuring a sustainable settlement at the spending review will help London maintain and upgrade its transportation infrastructure. Fourth, contributions from developers could also play a role. CLF has highlighted concerns around reforms set out in the Planning for the Future White Paper. Any proposed amendments to developer contributions must ensure that local authorities are able to secure sufficient contributions in order to deliver the local infrastructure that is needed with relation to new developments across the capital. And finally, in many of the areas we've highlighted in this document, from digital connectivity to electric vehicle charging, private investment will play a crucial role. Central government should work with London government and with the business community to ensure a supportive environment for private sector investment in infrastructure. This should include both clearly articulating priorities and the investment pipeline and ensuring a supportive regulatory regime in order to give investors confidence. Final slide, please. So to summarise, infrastructure plays a vital role in underpinning central London's economic success. Our infrastructure keeps the city and its people moving, connected and productive. Maintaining modern and sustainable infrastructure will be vital to ensuring the capital remains both a preeminent world city, an engine of growth and a great place to live. London's infrastructure will also be crucial in responding to the climate emergency, both through reducing emissions and responding to the global warming we will inevitably see in the coming years. We hope this report, which sets out our shared infrastructure priorities for central London, helps contribute to the debate. CLF and our member authorities are ready to work with central government, the Mayor of London and other stakeholders to ensure the delivery of the projects highlighted in this document and central London's wider infrastructure needs. Thank you very much, and I'll pass back to Councillor Campbell.
Hi everyone, I think we're having some kind of tech issue. Councillor Campbell is on mute and we can't seem to unmute her. Thank you very much, Georgina. I'm the tech person here. I'm now going to pass over to our next speaker on the panel, which is John Dickey. And whilst we're doing that, we can see if we can fix Councillor Campbell's tech. So passing over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and thank you to Elizabeth and Georgina. And indeed, congratulations to all of you at CLF and the team for producing what I think is a very lucid, succinct and compelling analysis of London's infrastructure needs. Let me give you my perspective on why infrastructure matters to business. London's success as one of the world's greatest economic powerhouses over the past centuries is down to its people and the collective of the businesses that they've formed. It's the private sector's creativity, innovation, and at-risk capital that drives jobs and growth. But cities are big and complex beasts, and for a business to thrive in London, it needs the city's systems, its architecture, its plumbing to work. And that's where infrastructure comes in. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but also talk a little bit about how we finance it and fund it in my remarks this afternoon. We can split in London infrastructure into three groups. There is, firstly, the infrastructure that's provided by the private sector under regulation, energy, waste, water. There's then the infrastructure provided by a largely competitive sector, and that's telecommunications. And then there is the infrastructure largely provided by the public sector, principally transport. Now, full disclosure, the firms I mention in the course of these remarks are, I think, all London First members. Now, in this first category, firms set out what their customers want. They are subject to economic regulation, and the regulators adjudicate on what it is that will be delivered. A synthesis takes place. The issue here for London is whether we're too focused on the price consumers pay rather than the resilience we need. Thames Water's average water main is 70 years old. And around 1/8 of the trunk mains, that's the big pipes, are over 150 years old. Victoria was on the throne when they were built. No wonder they leak. Do we want to fund the business to update them more rapidly to meet the challenges of economic growth and of climate change? And on energy, the political sensitivities around prices are obvious, particularly at the moment. But again, there are some big challenges we need to think how we're going to meet, particularly around climate change. We will not facilitate a shift to electric vehicles without at least a comprehensive pan-London rollout of charging infrastructure. And as Georgina said, some of this will be provided by the private sector if the regulatory frameworks are right, but some of it will need to be provided by the regulated utilities. And again, we need the right incentives, the right economic regulatory mechanisms if we're to roll this out at the pace that I think we all want to see. Now, turning to the second category, digital connectivity, London has, I think, done well, perhaps surprisingly well through the pandemic. Councillor Campbell's problems with broadband and KNC notwithstanding this afternoon. The big issue here is, I think, the not spots that we have in London, those parts of the city where the market isn't providing adequate infrastructure. Here, as the report notes, the recent award of the contract to roll out digital infrastructure across TfL's network to BAI is really significant, not just because it will end the tube being a not spot for all of us, but also because it will bring a scale network across much of London, which will enable a lot of other services to be run off the back of it. And then we come to, now Alex is going to say, I'm sure, a lot more lucidly than I will, some of the challenges TfL faces in a minute. But the big fundamental issue here is that unlike the first two sectors, the utilities and telecommunications, consumers mostly don't pay the full costs of the services they consume. Transport is essentially a loss-making endeavour. The report sets out CLF's priority schemes and broader investment priorities, and they're good, and they're largely unfunded. And at a time of TfL's operating revenues being dramatically down because of lower ridership, our first priority must be to keep those services going. The report talks about funding options and cites some of the work we London First did earlier in the year. That work explores how we construct a funding model and an approach to transport that's forward-looking, a network for London's needs in the 2020s and not a better 2015, taking account, for example, the innovations around on-demand transport and micro-mobility, some of which are already putting some strains on the way in which the transport system worked in 2019. We share the view in this report that the first best and first fairest way to pay for London's transport, both operations and investment, is that government returns through devolution or through grant a tiny sliver of the net tax revenues that we contribute to the Exchequer. But that may not happen. Elizabeth talked earlier about some of the stresses and strains around the levelling up agenda. And I fear we're going to have to look at ways in which we can replace the cash we as Londoners used to give to our transport network by tapping in and out every day with other sources of locally generated revenue. And that, like any change, will be difficult. And it will require a lot of discussion and debate if it's to be seen as legitimate by Londoners. And we might discuss this later in the Q&A. But in the context of infrastructure and the economic recovery, nothing that is in play matters more than this system. London cannot remain one of the world's leading economic powerhouses without a world-class transport network. Thank you.
Hooray, hopefully you can hear me. You can, good, that's always helpful. I'd just like to say, I think you're absolutely right, John. Hopefully I'm not going to, the two things you're right about. Number one, terrible connectivity in Kensington and Chelsea today. And secondly, nothing matters more than infrastructure. Absolutely right. Thank you for that. And now can we hand over to Kate Hand, please. And Kate, I ought to say, actually, is a head of climate change at London Council. So look forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Thank you, Councillor Campbell, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to join you this afternoon. And congratulations to CLF for bringing this report together. I feel like we spent a lot of time this year talking about the critical role that local government has in leading on climate change, and this report I think is absolutely part of that. So from a London Council's perspective, and for anyone who's not aware, London Council is the association of the 32 boroughs and the City of London, including all of the CLF members, of course. This report reflects a lot of the priorities that boroughs across the capital have. In our spending review submission, we called for a sustainable medium-term financial settlement for TfL to provide certainty, for demonstration that active travel really remains a priority for this government, for more funding for electric vehicles, and of course we talked a lot about net zero, so a lot of commonality there. I think across the piece it's about thinking about how we can take kind of economic, environmental and social priorities and link them up in place-based investment, which is what I think this report talks to. And also, of course, it talks to the concerns of Londoners themselves, not just the business community, but everyone. We're just about to launch tomorrow the second year of our polling on Londoners' attitudes to climate change, which demonstrates that everyone in London is really concerned about this issue. So do look out for the report tomorrow, but I think it very much builds on last year's results. So of course, really great to see net zero at front and centre of these priorities, and really welcome comments by Councillor Campbell and indeed Georgina and John in their remarks about the importance of this, particularly around the priority project 3 on climate change mitigation and resilience. And I really note that you've talked about mitigation and adaptation, which is, I think the adaptation committee refers to adaptation as the Cinderella of climate change, which is a resonant image, but very true. And actually, we need to see both of these principles integrated in these types of infrastructure coming forward, which I know is in your minds. I think just on the mitigation side first, buildings and transport are two of our biggest challenges in London and across the country. We've done a lot around the energy sector in the last couple of decades. That's actually, been responsible for a lot of our progress on climate change, but we have these challenging areas to address now. London Council's, for its part, has 7 collaborative programmes it's running together with all the boroughs to help bring together their efforts around the kind of key issues around net zero, and that includes Retrofit London, which is both about homes. It will eventually be about other types of buildings. We recognise it's absolutely not just about homes retrofits, but of course when you look at issues like fuel poverty, which are already very challenging in the city, that's where that kind of fits in. And then we've also got our low carbon transport programme, which I'm delighted is being co-led by Westminster, one of the CLF boroughs. And I hope that those 7 programmes will be able to really support and kind of integrate with some of the things that we're talking about here. I think just to go into this a bit more, retrofit is a technical challenge, but also, of course, a huge green economy growth opportunity. And we see that the skills and supply chains we need in London, we don't yet have, are not just for London or just in London. They will be for the wider southeast. They will be for the wider country as well. So there are those strong links. And on the transport side, really pleased to see the emphasis on active travel, because whilst we very much support more electric vehicle charging, and we should remember that London is already a great leader in that aspect, we need a lot more, but we also need active travel, because if you just take people out of fossil fuel cars and put them into EVs, you don't secure any of those public health benefits that are the directors of public health are always reminding us are really, really important for our wider ambitions as a city. And then just on the adaptation side, I think it's worth stressing that we know from the Committee on Climate Change, the Climate Change Committee, as they now are, that it's going to be, adaptation will be a critical issue specifically for infrastructure. And the committee's latest finding in the middle of this year is that for the UK as a whole, adaptation and policy and implementation is not keeping up with the increased scale of risk. And of course, we have seen those risks manifested in London this year and in recent years. 2 of the risks that the committee is most concerned about, out of what I have to say is a very long list, are risks to people in the economy from climate-related failure of power supplies, going back to the point about utilities and whether our grid actually is ready to support all the electrification that we need and that businesses need, and also risks to human health, well-being and productivity from increasing exposure to heat. We know that about 2,500 people die every year from heat, at the moment, and that could triple by the 2050s if we don't take action. And of course, with more people working from home, this isn't, it never was, but isn't just an issue for workplaces and homes, but there's a lot more kind of porous interconnection there. And I really also note that you talk about sustainable, inclusive infrastructure, and I think it's worth really highlighting that point, because of course, inclusive approaches are not an add-on. You know, we can either address or exacerbate inequalities in the way in which we deliver climate-proof infrastructure. So I think it's great that that's been highlighted. And then finally, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the approach to funding sources that you've outlined. You know, as you say, there is a very strong case for direct investment, and there's other sources that you've looked at, and we are certainly making those arguments through our work on the spending review and in conversations with government. But I think, you know, your last point on private investment is an important one, and it's one that we haven't historically across kind of government thought so much about, but we are going to need it for net zero, because, you know, there is not going to be, even in a really best case scenario, the government is not going to provide the probably hundreds of billions that we think we need across UK local government. So our contribution to that has been working with the Connected Places Catapult and Core Cities on something called the Cities Climate Investment Commission, which the CLF members have been very much part of. The aim is to take the gap between, we know we need place-based net zero investment, and we know that there is financing out there, and to create a set of robust investable propositions which can really take and use that investment in an appropriate way, which sounds simple and is very challenging, but I think we're making a really good progress with actually coming to an understanding of how we can do that and how we can generate returns for investors in an effective and appropriate way, but also deliver the infrastructure and other net zero needs that we have. I think it's worth highlighting that, so those 12 cities, so the core cities in London, are more than 50% of the UK economy, and of course quite a big portion of that is central London. So, you know, we are really, really pleased to be working with the core cities, because, as I think Georgina said, this is certainly not just about London. We all have these needs. We all need structures and ways in which we can bring in private investment, but not just to cherry pick the good investments in a local place, but to take a more holistic approach that really makes sense in a place-based way. Yeah, so that's I think going to be an important part of this picture, and we are launching that on Thursday. So sorry, big week for us as well, and also at the COP. So I look forward to sharing more about that. So I think that's it for me. I mean, great to see net zero front and centre, both mitigation and adaptation, and great to see alignment with those wider London priorities, and looking forward to working with CLF colleagues going forward around this.
Thank you, Kate. And now, last but definitely not least, is Alex Williams, Director of City Planning at Transport for London.
Thank you, Councillor Campbell, and thank you, CLF, for the report. I think it's an excellent report, and I think it's really well timed as well, actually. So what I was going to do today in my 3 minutes is just tell you a bit about where we are on our recovery journey, where we are on finances, and talk about our own priorities from an infrastructure perspective. So if we go to the next slide, where we are in terms of our recovery is we are really keen to support the recovery, and we're doing a lot of work to kind of keep up the service levels, to keep a very clean and well-controlled network, and to encourage people back, as you can see from the kind of the campaign about going out, or best day ever, that kind of stuff. It is working. On the tube last week, we had 60% of normal ridership levels during the week and 75% on the bus. And I think it is working in terms of leisure and discretionary travel. It's not working in the way that we would like it to on return to office and also return to international tourism. And I think there's still more work to be done there, but we're heading in the right direction. We would like to go faster in this regard, but we're heading in the right direction. Should we go to the next slide? The next slide is about money. Pre-pandemic, we were becoming less reliant on government support and more reliant on fares income. So that's why we had 72% of our income from fares, much higher than any other international city. The pandemic highlighted that we were too reliant on fares, And we've been, since the pandemic, heavily reliant on government support, for which we are very, very grateful. Circa £5 billion of public money is a big investment to kind of keep the show on the road. But the reality is that we haven't got full recovery of our fare box, and we will need funding support beyond the end of the current funding deal, which ends on the 11th of December this year. There is an issue there, I think, really, that we're on a series of short-term deals, and we do need long-term funding certainty to deliver the infrastructure that this city clearly needs. Next slide. So what are our priorities? I would kind of pick them in, go into kind of 4 groups there about decarbonisation, improving public transport, healthy and efficient streets, and maintaining our network. I think the other point to note is, and the stuff on the left there, the text on the left there really, is that it's harder to get investment in infrastructure in London than it's ever been. The attention of the government is elsewhere. I think there's a perception that investment should be anywhere but London. And I think that in that context, we have to be very smart about how we lever in investment into infrastructure in the country. So in London, rather. Our positioning has been highlighting how it supports recovery, how it supports levelling up, because investment in London's infrastructure invariably involves the supply chain around the rest of the country, how it's really important for decarbonisation. I think there are other levers we'll push on in terms of the acuteness of the problems in London. From an air quality perspective, we're doing a lot there, but the city suffers from some of the worst air quality in the country. Social inclusion, huge amounts of pockets of deprivation in every borough, to be honest. So a lot of work to be done there about how we position it in a smart way. If you think about some of our priorities, I think we have to focus on maintaining our network as being the most important priority in the current financial circumstance. Hammersmith Bridge highlights how the current funding model doesn't work in London. If that bridge wasn't in London, it would have been fixed by now, or at least there'd be a deal to sort out it's going to be fixed. We're still working that through and no clear end in sight on that. A lot of work on healthy streets with the London Street Space programme, and I think a lot of work in the boroughs now to think through how many of those schemes are permanent, as a kind of permanent redefinition about how the city works. Improving public transport. We've got contracts to replace the Piccadilly line trains manufactured elsewhere in the country, DLR, and electrifying the bus fleet. You can't commit to those in the longer term unless you've got a longer term funding deal. So we really want to carry on delivering those because it's so important to support the city's growth and recovery, and decarbonisation, which I'll come into a bit more detail in a bit. Go to the next slides. Your report highlights the need to continue working Crossrail 2 and Bakerloo line. We're also working on DLR to Thamesmead. We completely agree with you on that. Those longer term projects remain a priority, and the case is still strong. The reality, though, is that they are going to take longer to deliver, and we need to kind of focus on the kind of case making work for them and protecting the work we've done thus far, particularly for Crossrail 2, from where we are now. We're not going to get a funding deal for those anytime soon, but we keep the projects alive and keep working on them so that when we are in a better position financially, we can work out which one we press the go button. And the final slides is on the work we're doing on climate change, really. On Monday, we will expand the ULEZ scheme to Inner London. That is the biggest and most impactful scheme we've done on the surface road, on the road network in London in our history. 18 times the size of current Central London zone. It will have a massive benefit to the air quality of the city, and we're ready to go on that. Electrifying our bus fleet, that's been mentioned. We need investment to get that going. We've got a programme, and we can accelerate that if there is more support from the government. That links into all of our work to electrify vehicles in London. It can deliver some big returns as well, potentially circa 2.6 million tonnes of carbon per annum reduction as a result of accelerating the electrification of our fleets. So a lot of returns there that we could be delivering with support. Climate change adaptation, as Kate mentioned, it's the kind of the poor relation, really, I think, really of the work on decarbonisation. But I think the recent flooding in the summer highlighted that how London has got a lot of work to do there, really. And we're certainly cognizant of that and want to look at that ourselves, really, about what we can do in that regard, really. So that's it from me, a quick kind of canter through our view of the report. We really welcome it. We're very supportive of it, but I just think we need to be mindful of the national context. So I think it's harder to get investment in London than it's ever been, or certainly in our history as TfL for the last 20 or so years. And we need to be smarter about how we pitch that into the national stage and to other stakers as well. So that's it for me, Councillor Campbell. Happy to take questions.
Thank you. Trying to think how I turn my camera on, but maybe it's not going to work anyway. I think let's take the first question. Aha, my host has asked me to start my video. Okay, we are in operation. So thanks, Alex. I'm going to open up now to a panel discussion. So don't forget to keep posting all your Q&As in the Q&A. I think, Georgina, I'm going to ask you to answer the first question, which was, how do we form relationships with private investors as a local authority? Someone's asking.
Thank you, Councillor Campbell. I would say this perhaps might be beyond me and perhaps might be better for John from London First, as he is the CEO of the business group.
Okay. John, yeah, I think maybe you pick it up.
That one, thank you.
Well, let me come in sort of high-level terms. I think the fundamental issue for effective working together between the private and public sectors, particularly around long-term investments, such as around infrastructure, is a clarity as to where risk best sits around delivery and a clarity in what constitutes fair risk-based return. One of the big challenges the private sector often has in working with any part of government is government does two or three things often badly. One is it is prone to changing the spec of what it wants, even when the project's underway. The second is it's prone to misunderstanding and misallocating the risk around projects. The third is we can get into all kinds of hot water if the private sector takes on a substantial risk. It manages that risk well and makes profit, because some people then think it's illegitimate and outrageous that the private sector is getting some kind of return on the capital it's put at risk or invested. So I think getting the framework right and being transparent about those issues and communicating them well and succinctly. One of the big challenges across all of this is that we talk a lot about how we finance infrastructure and we don't talk too much about how we fund it. There's only one source of ultimate funding for infrastructure, and that's us. We can pay for it through taxes, we can pay for it through bills, we can pay for it through other charges, but ultimately we all as Londoners, as people, need to pay for it. And I think it's been clear how we put in place delivery mechanisms that will lower those end costs, or at least keep those end costs as low as possible, which is the really productive space, public and private partnership.
Thank you. And the next question, let's see who would like to answer this one. Given the government's focus on tackling emissions, do you think there will be funding from government to upgrade infrastructure, including buses, to reduce emissions? I don't know, Alex, whether you want to have a go at this one?
Well, there is funding to shift buses to zero emission. Our struggle is getting some of that money to be invested in London, because we have circa 500 electric or hydrogen buses out on our roads at the moment. We've got plans to get up to 900, which will be around 12% of our fleet. You know, we've got a supply chain and a method of working that could get our fleet fully electrified by 2030. I think one of the challenges is outside of London, they're at a different starting position. I think the government is keen to invest there, really, and in two kind of smart cities where they can become fully electric. if they were going to kind of chase the numbers in terms of how many buses they could get to zero emission, London is the place to do it, because we can deliver at scale and at speed. So I just think it's the money is there. Our challenge is how we get a decent chunk of it coming into London. We've got a similar debate on electric vehicle charging, really, where we are, I think it was like 7,500 charging units in London, and we need more in London because most people live in houses that don't have off-street car parking. But I think our challenge is how we get a good chunk of the government's national pot allocated to the capital city. I don't know, Kate's probably closer to this than I am on this detail.
I think that's absolutely right. Like, we do lead the way in many respects, but London is a very large city with very many people with very many needs. So we need a lot more of this, and we absolutely support the call for London to get a fair share of resources when they come forward. But we quite often see that London is just excluded from funds that come forward, for kinds of transport infrastructure, not always, of course. And as Alex said, the investment we do get is very gratefully received, but we need to meet the needs of Londoners. So I think that it's an ongoing discussion with government about how we kind of approach, I suppose, how we approach levelling up, and how we shape an argument that is around supporting London's needs, which is part of a wider whole.
Yeah, and actually that's a very good segue into the next question, which was, the government's very focused on levelling up, as we all know, but how do we make the case that investment in infrastructure in the capital can support levelling up elsewhere? I don't know who wants to come in on this one. Maybe again, John.
Well, that's an easy one, Elizabeth. I think I've got 2 or 3 thoughts really on the way we need to approach this. I think the first is we always need to remind central government of the levelling up challenges within London and the bonkersness of taking money away from Tower Hamlets or Newham in order to spend it in Richmond and Yorkshire or Cheshire or the various other parts of the United Kingdom that actually are much more affluent than parts of London. We also need to remind everybody that while some of the London data look good at top line, earnings per person, once you take off housing costs, they look a lot less good and actually a lot like the kinds of levels of earnings in other cities in England. So I think we need to contextualize it, the first point. Secondly, I think we need to think about the role London can play in driving change across the country. I mean, Alex talked about buses and scale and supply chains. And one of the things, by virtue of having in transport an authority like PFL, is you can plan things. You can plan things in a way that UK manufacturers and other businesses can work against. And by doing that, you can build up a hydrogen bus or an electric bus supply chain in the UK, which in turn can then be used by other bus providers across the country in a way that will happen much less well if it's done happenstance by small authorities or small providers buying their own kit. It's much more likely to succeed if London takes the lead and provides that kind of core order book for the sector. And then the third thing is we do need to remember how important the economy of London is to the economy of the country as a whole. It's an extraordinary myth to think there's some kind of either or, them and us. We're in a highly integrated small island. The role London plays, for example, in attracting inward investment or for attracting overseas businesses to come here and see what it is they can buy here, or the role that we play as a large consumer. We account for 15% or so of the population. That's a lot of stuff we're buying. So we need to think about this in a much more integrated way than we sometimes do. And we need to remind government that it's really important for the whole of the country that London succeeds. A good thought experiment is, would the people of Newcastle or the people of Merseyside or the people of Taunton be better off if London didn't exist in the United Kingdom?
Exactly. Thank you, John. Okay, the next question, we're going to ask Kate to have a go at this one, which is, what are your thoughts on how we can get private investment into infrastructure relating to climate change?
An excellent question. So we need to make, so I think there was a lot of interest, those who are closer to investors pension funds, others than I am, reliably report there was a lot of interest, and we've seen private investors, your BlackRocks, etc., making their own net zero commitments, quite ambitious ones in some cases. There's obviously a lot of work going on for the COP brought together by Mark Carney around kind of net zero investment. So there is I think an increasing desire for people to decarbonize their own portfolios, and there is also the reputational risk of not doing so. And there's also the very increasingly clear argument around the returns that you can secure from more sustainable types of investment. The challenge that we have is that, talking about, there are areas where it is easier to invest in net zero. So electricity generation, renewables provides a relatively straightforward business case. We've seen that done across a number of authorities in the UK, sort of large solar farms. Local authorities aren't so much building wind, but that's fairly established. But that is not all that we need in the local area, particularly if we're looking at kind of solar on homes or on kind of distributed commercial spaces. So I think it's about constructing a portfolio that meets our needs across retrofit, across green infrastructure, across renewable electricity generation, and securing a return from those collectively, so that we can then essentially cross-subsidize a little bit into areas that we need it, so that we're not just having investors come and say, we'll invest in that bit because we'll get a good solid return from that, we're comfortable with that, we know how it works. But actually all that retrofitting thing is quite difficult in more deprived neighbourhoods, even where you've got really high levels of fuel poverty, and then the public sector is left with the complete the complete bill for that, even where there are returns, because it's more challenging or more risky. So we need to de-risk it really for investors and make it work in the local area. I think two other points to add to that. One is around aggregating finance. So the reason that we're working with core cities and the catapult is because, with the slight exception of London, working for an individual city or authority trying to attract private investment is quite difficult, just because of the scale of the projects that we have. Serious private investment, I'm reliably informed, needs about 500 million. That's the kind of scale of thing you need to be talking about. Now, London is very large, but many of the other core cities aren't quite as big. But actually, we all have the same sorts of needs. We will couch them in a slightly different way, but we basically need the same things. We benefit from coming together to aggregate those and saying the scale of the opportunity here in sustainable urban drainage, in retrofitting, in solar is really quite significant from a financial perspective. And we can only do that if we come together. Now, of course, in London, that means coming together across the boroughs, which, as I said, we're doing around the City's Climate Investment Commission. So I think that's in hand, but obviously that coordination takes a job of work, and needs funding in and of itself to be done. And the second thing is that we need actually skills development in local authorities. Truth be told, local authorities are not particularly used to attracting private investment for return. They've not generally been asked to do that. It's not been part of how local governments function. That's completely understandable. But actually we need to develop those skills so that we are understanding the risks that local authorities will be taking, and we're dealing with that proportionate and effective fashion. But that again requires skills development. It's a kind of underappreciated area of net zero skills development. We know we need people who understand district heating, but we also need people who understand how to construct a proposition for the market.
Thank you. And I'm now going to turn to Georgina with a question for you, which what are the anticipated difficulties for the developer contributions arising from the Planning for the Future white paper, do you think?
Thank you. So the Planning for the Future white paper was published, over a year ago now. And one of the reforms proposed was to replace the Community Infrastructure Levy, or CIL, and Section 106 with a nationally set flat rate infrastructure levy. We highlighted in our response and in our continued engagement with government and ministers that we believe that this would be severely detrimental for not only London, but actually quite a lot of the UK, depending on where that flat rate is set. From the London context, developing commercial and residential properties is a lot more expensive. Typically land values are higher. You are having to spend a lot more money throughout the process, and a nationally set levy may not reflect the financial burden for developers that it is to develop in London. We raised this obviously from CLF's perspective, from the viewpoint of our 12 Central London local authorities, that this would have a really detrimental impact, specifically in terms of affordable housing, but also in terms of the infrastructure that is typically funded through those two means, Section 106 and Community Infrastructure Levy. Specifically thinking about infrastructure, it could be small scale on-site interventions, but also it's the money that contributes towards the pots, the larger pots of money to fund more strategic infrastructure. So that's something that we raised, that really London in particular, other cities, but also everywhere up and down the country should be able to set and maintain their own locally set levy that reflects the cost within the region, the setting that you'd be developing in. So that is one of the issues that we've highlighted as well through this document. It's really important that London, as London continues to grow, both in terms of housing, but also other forms of development, London is able to fund the infrastructure through those mechanisms in a way that reflects how expensive it can be to develop in London.
Thank you. Now, I'm afraid I think we're going to have to wrap up now, but a huge big thank you to all our panelists today, to Georgina, Kate, John and Alex. And I hope all of you who've been watching have found this session insightful and interesting. Given the comprehensive spending review being announced next week and COP26 in the coming weeks, it's a really timely and important conversation to be having at the moment. And the government's absolutely right to recognise the need for investment in infrastructure across all regions of the UK. But for us in London, we must need to continue to bang the drum here and make the case for investment in the capital as well. A link to the document will be circulated following this event. And, please do get in touch with the team at CLF if you've got any other questions or queries. And then that's all from me, really, apart from say thank you all very much for joining us today. And I hope you have a really lovely afternoon. Thank you.